I should have sensed something was off the moment I woke up to an eerie silence outside my window, a stillness that didn't match the usual hum of the neighborhood. When I opened the door, the sight that greeted me was absurd. A tow truck parked smack in my driveway, its winch poised like a vulture over my car. Next to it stood two men in those generic uniforms the HOA hands out to its volunteers, the kind that make them feel like they're law enforcement instead of glorified hall monitors. They were there, clipboard and radio in hand, ready to haul away my car. My perfectly legal car, parked on my own property, in my own garage, exactly where it had been since I moved in. It took me a second to process the sheer ridiculousness of it all, like a scene from a bad comedy sketch unfolding in real time. One of the guys was scribbling on a notepad, probably pretending to document some earth-shattering violation, while the other muttered into a radio as if he were orchestrating a SWAT raid instead of a petty towing job. This wasn't just an overzealous inspection. It was a robbery dressed up in bureaucratic nonsense. I decided to hold my tongue, partly because I was curious how far they'd take this farce, and partly because I wanted them to dig their own graves before I stepped in. The moment one of them started hooking my car to the winch, I couldn't stay silent anymore. I had to act. "Nice job, huh?" I said, catching the notepad guy off guard. He jolted, then puffed up with fake authority and snorted, "This is an official HOA action. Your vehicle in violation of parking regulations." I crossed my arms, already savoring the absurdity. "Violations? What violations?" He flipped open his notepad, jabbing at a page drowning in fine print, and declared, "Section 14, paragraph 7, line 3. No private vehicles can stay parked in residential areas for over 48 consecutive hours without significant movement." I blinked, trying to wrap my head around whether he actually believed that garbage. "So you're towing my car because it's been in my garage?" I asked, barely hiding my grin. He nodded solemnly like he just cited the Magna Carta. "That's the rule, sir. The HOA takes these infractions seriously." That's when it hit me they had no clue who they were dealing with. They didn't know I was the city's chief of police, and oh, how delicious that twist was going to be. I played along, keeping my cards close. "What's the fine for this major infraction?" The radio guy finally piped up. $150. I nearly laughed out loud. "You're telling me you're towing an $80,000 car over a $150 fine?" The notepad guy faltered, his brain catching up to the lunacy, but he doubled down. "Rules are rules." Meanwhile, neighbors started peeking out, some whispering, one filming, even a dog watching like it knew someone was about to crash and burn. The absurdity of the situation was escalating, and I could feel the tension building as the tow truck's engine rumbled to life. They were actually going to take my car. Neighbors were gathering now, drawn by the spectacle like moths to a flame, their phones out, recording every second of this HOA circus. I took a deep breath, deciding it was time to pull the plug on their little charade before they drove off with my property. "It's okay, just give me a second," I said calmly, pulling my phone from my pocket and dialing a number I knew by heart. My precinct's dispatch line. "Captain," my sergeant answered, his voice steady on the other end. "I need a car at my address. My vehicle seems to have been stolen," I said, keeping my tone deadpan. There was a brief pause, then a sharp, "I'm sending a unit now." I hung up and turned to the two HOA clowns, their faces still smug with misplaced confidence. "Quick warning, gentlemen," I said, letting a grin creep in. "I'm the chief of police. In a few minutes, a squad car will be here, and we'll see who's really breaking the law." Their bravado melted like ice in a microwave, replaced by wide-eyed panic as they exchanged nervous glances. The notepad guy gestured frantically at the tow truck driver to kill the engine, while the radio guy stood frozen, finally grasping the mess he'd waded into. "We can't let him intimidate the HOA," he blustered, puffing out his chest like a cartoon hero, but the neighbors' laughter drowned him out. The elderly couple filming chuckled, and the woman with her phone looked like she'd struck viral gold. Then came the distant wail of sirens, sweet music to my ears, and the HOA duo paled as if they'd seen a ghost. The tow truck's engine cut off instantly, and reality began sinking in for them. They weren't just hassling some random homeowner. Two of my officers rolled up, stepping out of their cruiser with the calm of men who knew exactly what was happening. I gave a subtle nod to one who smirked. He could tell this was going to be a show worth watching. He strolled over to the HOA pair and asked, Can someone explain why there's a tow truck trying to take the police chief's car? The notepad guy stammered, flipping through his pages like a lifeline might magically appear, while the radio guy went mute, his earlier bravado nowhere to be found. I leaned in, arms crossed, and said, "Please explain the situation, I'm curious." The officer raised a hand, cutting off their floundering. "Are you both policemen? Do you have authority to impound vehicles? A court order, maybe?" Silence hung heavy, thicker than the morning fog, and I knew I had them cornered. The silence from the HOA duo was deafening, their earlier swagger replaced by the kind of dread you see in someone who's just realized they've stepped into quicksand. My officer stood there, notepad in hand, mirroring their own tactic back at them with a twist of real authority. "Removing a private vehicle without legal authorization is attempted theft," he said, his tone flat but cutting, and I watched their eyes widen as the weight of that statement sank in. I couldn't resist adding fuel to the fire. "I'm also curious what the HOA board thinks of this. Anyone know if this was approved?" I asked, turning to the growing crowd of neighbors who were now fully invested in the drama. The elderly couple filming shook their heads, still laughing. "We haven't heard a thing," the man said while another neighbor chimed in. "That fine's not even official, far as I know." My officer scribbled a few notes, then looked up at the HOA pair. "So we've got an illegal vehicle removal attempt, no court order, no HOA board approval. Seems like a mess. Want me to keep going, or have you figured out you're in deep?" The notepad guy started sweating bullets, his hands trembling as he clutched his useless clipboard, while the radio guy stared at the ground, probably praying for a sinkhole to swallow him whole. That's when the cherry on top arrived. A shrill voice cut through the air, demanding, "What's going on here?" I turned to see Karen, the HOA president herself, storming down the sidewalk like a general charging into battle, her notebook gripped like a weapon. Her short hair was a mess, her face flushed with fury, and she clearly had no idea she was walking into her own downfall. "Can someone explain why there's a police car here?" She snapped, glaring at her two minions, who now looked like scolded kids caught stealing cookies. "What did you do?" she barked at me, and I smiled. "Oh, nothing much. Just called the police because your guys tried to steal my car in broad daylight." Karen blinked, processing my words, then huffed. "Steal? That's standard HOA procedure." My officer raised an eyebrow. "So you authorized this?" he asked, pinning her with a look that made her falter. "The HOA has authority over condo rules," she stammered, but he cut her off. "Not quite. We've got no evidence you can tow vehicles without formal permission, especially from someone's garage." The neighbors stifled giggles as Karen's face twisted, caught between rage and panic. She flipped open her notebook, desperate to regain control, and jabbed at the same regulation her lackeys had cited. "Section 14, paragraph 7, line 3, no parking over 48 hours without movement." I let out a laugh. "You're really sticking with that? Towing a car from my garage because I didn't drive it for 2 days." The crowd's amusement grew, and I could see her crumbling under the weight of her own absurdity. Karen's grip on her notebook tightened as she stood there, cornered by her own ridiculous rule, her face a mix of defiance and desperation. My officer sighed, clearly done with the nonsense, and asked, "Do you have records proving this car hasn't moved in over 48 hours?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again, floundering like a fish out of water. Because of course she had nothing but hot air and a power trip. The neighbors watched her flail, their amusement turning the scene into a live comedy show, and I decided it was time to drop the hammer. "By the way, Karen, do you know whose car this is?" I asked, keeping my tone casual but sharp. She snorted, "Yours, obviously," still clinging to her crumbling throne. I nodded slowly, letting the moment build. "And do you know who I am?" Her smugness flickered, confusion creeping in, and my officer stepped in with a grin. "No one told you he's the city's chief of police, huh?" The color drained from her face, her eyes darting like a trapped animal as the reality hit. She just tried to tow the top cop's car over a made-up rule. "Now, just for fun," the officer continued, "trying to remove his vehicle without permission is a crime. If it's intentional, we're talking abuse of power and misappropriation." Karen started sweating, her voice shaky as she backpedaled. "Wait, let's think about this calmly." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Sure, let's think. Chief, you want to file a formal complaint?" Every eye turned to me, even Karen's, her breath held like she was awaiting a guillotine drop. I crossed my arms, milking the suspense, then sighed dramatically. I could sue the HOA into oblivion, but there's a simpler fix. Karen perked up, grasping at straws. Great, we can find a reasonable solution, she said, almost pleading. I smirked, ready to twist the knife. I want this $150 fine officially revoked, and you, Karen, to email every resident admitting the HOA screwed up. Her expression collapsed into horror. She'd rather eat glass than face that humiliation, but she had no choice. She hesitated, searching for an escape, but the crowd's stares and my officer's notepad left her boxed in. Okay, she muttered, the word forced out like a curse. What? I asked, feigning deafness, making her squirm. All right, I'll cancel the fine and send the email, she gritted through clenched teeth. The neighbors erupted in applause, the filming couple nearly choking with laughter, and even my officer cracked a smile. Good choice, Karen, he said. Now I suggest unhooking that tow truck before someone sues you for obstruction. Her minions scrambled to free my car, moving faster than I'd ever seen, while Karen stormed off, fuming but defeated, for now. I knew her type, though. She wouldn't slink away quietly, and I was ready for whatever petty revenge she'd cook up next. Karen's retreat felt like a temporary ceasefire, not a surrender, and I knew better than to think she'd let that public humiliation slide. Sure enough, 3 days later, a new HOA notice landed in my mailbox, and when I opened it, I couldn't believe the audacity, or maybe I could, given who I was dealing with. It read, Dear resident, you are notified of a public nuisance due to an improper event on your property that caused discomfort to others. The HOA deems this a violation of conduct rules, requiring your attendance at a disciplinary hearing. I read it 3 times, laughing harder each time. She was trying to fine me for calling the police when her goons attempted to steal my car. The sheer absurdity of it was almost admirable, like a desperate dictator clinging to power after a coup. I decided right then I'd attend this hearing. If Karen wanted a stage, I'd give her a performance she'd never forget. Word of the tow truck fiasco had spread like wildfire, so the meeting room was packed, every chair filled with residents eager to see round 2 of this HOA meltdown. Karen sat at the head of the table, trying to project regal authority, but her confidence was shaky. Maybe she sensed the room wasn't on her side anymore, or maybe she knew her latest stunt was a stretch even for her. Sir, she began, her voice dripping with forced formality, you've been summoned to address your recent violation of coexistence rules. I crossed my arms, leaning back. What violation would that be? She huffed. You caused an uproar by involving the police in a matter that could have been handled internally. I couldn't hold back a chuckle. Wait, you're saying I should have handled it internally when you tried to steal my car? The room erupted in laughter, neighbors nudging each other, but Karen doubled down, her face reddening. The HOA has procedures to prevent abuse of authority, she snapped, and that was the breaking point. Her accusing me of abuse after her power play was too rich to ignore. I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. If we're talking abuse of authority, Karen, let's discuss how you sent your minions to confiscate my property and use the HOA to bully anyone you don't like. The room went quiet, her throat bobbing as she swallowed hard. I had the crowd now. Anyone here ever get a ridiculous fine from the HOA? I asked, scanning the faces. Hands shot up. Got one for leaving my trash can out 5 minutes late, a guy said. Fine for my grass being 2 centimeters too long, a woman added. More voices piped up, beige curtains, uprooted gardens, kids playing too loud, and suddenly it clicked for everyone. Karen wasn't enforcing rules, she was wielding them like a petty tyrant for kicks. The tide had turned and she was about to drown in it. The meeting room buzzed with a mix of outrage and glee as residents aired their grievances, each story more absurd than the last, painting a clear picture of Karen's reign of petty terror. She tried to regain control, slamming her hand on the table and shouting, "The HOA exists to maintain community standards." But it was like yelling into a hurricane. Nobody cared anymore. Then a neighbor stood up, pointing at her with a question that cut through the noise. So why aren't the HOA's financial records public? The room went still, all eyes on Karen, who froze like a deer in headlights. She hadn't expected the fight to shift from her rules to her wallet. Another resident jumped in. Yeah, why have our fees gone up every year with no improvements? The silence that followed was suffocating, Karen's face glistening with sweat as she fumbled for an excuse. Those records are managed internally, she mumbled, but the crowd wasn't buying it. Then came the knockout blow. "Can you show us the financials now?" a woman asked, her tone sharp and unforgiving. Corinne's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She was cornered, and everyone could see it. The HOA's facade of legitimacy was crumbling, and she was the architect of its collapse. I sat back watching the chaos unfold, almost feeling sorry for her, almost. Years of abusing power had caught up, and the residents weren't just mad about my car anymore. They were done with the whole system she'd built. "If you've got nothing to hide, show us," a man pressed, and Corinne's eyes darted around, searching for an ally, but her two tow truck minions were long gone, probably wishing they never met her. The room turned into a chorus of demands, transparency, accountability, answers, and she had none to give. It was over, and she knew it. The HOA's reign was dead, and she'd buried it with her own arrogance. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift and brutal. An investigation kicked off, residents demanding access to the HOA's books, and when they got it, the truth spilled out like a busted dam. Thousands of dollars were missing, siphoned off through shady expenses Corinne couldn't explain. She tried to dodge the heat, claiming clerical errors, but the evidence was ironclad, and guess who oversaw the case? My department. Ironic, considering she'd tried to intimidate me with her clipboard crew. She didn't just lose her HOA throne. She faced court dates, legal fees, and a reputation shredded beyond repair. The neighbors, meanwhile, started joking she'd tow her own car next just to pay the fines. Corinne's downfall was a spectacle, but it wasn't the end of the story, more like the beginning of a reckoning for the whole HOA mess. After the financial scandal broke, the condo turned into a beehive of activity, residents buzzing with plans to dismantle the system she'd lorded over. They held a small assembly, not one of her dictator-style meetings, but a real discussion, and decided the HOA was done for good. No more fines for beige curtains or kids splashing too loud. They'd set simple guidelines, no bureaucracy, just neighbors agreeing to keep things civil without a power-hungry middleman. I watched it all from my garage, my car still parked there like a trophy of the battle I'd accidentally started. The place didn't collapse into chaos without Corinne's iron fist. Lawns stayed mowed, houses looked sharp, and people actually talked to each other instead of snitching to a clipboard tyrant. It was proof her rules were never about order, they were about control, and without her the condo thrived. I'd catch neighbors grinning at me as they passed, some thanking me for toppling the queen, others just relieved they could live without her shadow looming over every trash can and flower bed. Corinne, meanwhile, didn't fade quietly. She couldn't resist one last jab, sending me a snarky letter claiming I ruined the community spirit. I laughed, framing it next to my badge as a reminder of her delusion. She was too busy dodging court hearings to cause real trouble, but I knew her type. She'd stew, plot, maybe even try to slink back someday. My officers kept tabs on her case, and every update was a little victory. Misused funds here, forged receipts there, all piling up to ensure she'd never run anything bigger than a lemonade stand again. The irony was thick. The police she'd scoffed at were the ones sealing her fate. For me, it was a quiet triumph. Nothing beats watching a bully crumble under their own weight. Every time I pulled into my driveway, I'd glance at my car and remember how it started. Two clowns with a tow truck, a petty fine, and a woman who thought she could outmuscle the chief of police. The neighbors turned it into a legend, retelling it at barbecues with embellishments. Corinne riding the tow truck like a chariot, me chasing her off with a siren-blazing squad car. I didn't correct them. It was too good a story, and honestly, seeing her empire fall was sweeter than any fiction they could dream up. The condo settled into a strange, peaceful rhythm after the HOA's collapse, like a town recovering from a dictator's reign. No more notices in mailboxes, no more petty fines, just people living their lives. The assembly's new guidelines worked like a charm. Keep your yard decent, don't blast music at 3 a.m., basic stuff everyone agreed on without needing a Corinne to enforce it. I'd see neighbors chatting over fences instead of glaring over rule books, and it hit me. Her tyranny had never held us together. It had just kept us on edge. My car stayed put in the garage, a quiet symbol of the chaos that accidentally sparked freedom. Corinne's legal mess dragged on, each court date peeling back more of her scam. Thousands misspent on consultants who never existed. Repairs nobody saw. My officers handled it with a grin, knowing they were tying up the loose ends of her reign. She tried pleading ignorance, but the paper trail was a noose, and the judge wasn't buying her act. Rumors flew she'd moved to a rental across town, stripped of her condo crown, probably glaring at her new neighbor's unapproved mailboxes. I didn't care where she went. Out of sight, out of mind, though I'd bet she was still scribbling fines in her dreams. The neighbors turned the whole saga into a local myth, a cautionary tale swapped over beers at summer cookouts. "Remember when the chief took down the HOA with one phone call?" They'd say, laughing, and I'd nod, letting them run with it. The truth was simpler. I just wanted my car left alone. But I liked their version better, me as the hero, Karen as the cartoon villain undone by her own hubris. They even threw a little party once, toasting the day the tow truck ran. And I raised a glass, thinking how a $150 fine had toppled an empire of nonsense. Looking back, it was less about me and more about everyone waking up to her game, residents who'd grumbled in silence finally finding their voice. My garage became a quiet victory lap, a spot I'd park and smirk, remembering the sirens, the panic on her face, the applause when she caved. The condo didn't need an HOA after all. It needed people who'd call out the Karens before they got too comfy. If she ever tried coming back, she'd find a neighborhood ready to laugh her off again. And me, still the chief, still parking where I damn well pleased. Nothing beats watching a dictator fall, especially when all it took was standing my ground and letting her dig her own grave.